Hello, and thank you for logging into today's session. James Scullen here from the Australia-China Business Council. Welcome to today's ACBC National Briefing, the State of Australia-China Relations with the Australian Ambassador to China, Fletcher. I'd like to begin by acknowledging I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We last spoke to the ambassador back in December, and now 3 months later, we find the Australia-China relationship still in a challenging position. Since then, a new US administration has taken office and pledged to be more assertive in defending the interests of Australian businesses facing trade difficulties with China. Yet, as we saw in the US-China meetings in Anchorage last week, relying on a more internationally engaged US to reverse the sorry state of Australia-China economic relations is easier said than done. On today's session, we'll look to take stock of the current status of Australia's trade and investment relationship with China and look to identify areas where there are green shoots in the relationship that we can look to chart a positive and proactive path forward. We're most grateful once again to the Australian Ambassador to China, Fletcher, who has kindly offered to address ACBC members and AustCham members on the broader pressing issues concerning the bilateral relationship. Joining the ambassador today is the embassy's Minister Counsellor, Economic, Lachlan Crews, who will brief members on the outlook of China's economy in light of the recently announced 14th five-year plan. We'll also be hearing from Austrade's General Manager for Greater China, Daniel Boyer, who will shed light on what China's future economic trajectory means for business and share insights on consumer behaviour and digital trends. Following the presentations from the embassy, we'll cross to former AustCham Hong Kong CEO, Jacinta Reddan, who will once again moderate the Q&A for today's session. We've received a number of questions from ACBC and AustCham members that Jacinta will put to the panel concerning travel to China, vaccine passports, how Australian policy is being felt on the ground in China, and what Australian businesses can do to mitigate the risk of doing business in China. As there's so much to discuss today, the ambassador has been very generous with his time, and we'll be concluding today's session at 15 minutes past the hour. We'll also be recording today's session, and the link to today's briefing will be emailed to today's attendees, as well as being made available on ACBC and Austrade channels. Now, before we cross to the embassy, first a word to ACBC members from David Olsen, the National President and Chairman of the Australia-China Business Council, who's joining us from Sydney. David, thanks for being with us, and it's over to you. Sorry, David, I think you might be on mute there.
My apologies. So thank you, James, and let me add my welcome to everybody here today. Today's event is part of a national series of webinars that the Australia-China Business Council is organising, which we started last year. We host dialogues, discussions, and we want to explore topics related to China's development, to its relationships around the world, and particularly to Australia in a post-pandemic world, and where we share insights and opinions from diplomats, government leaders, industry and business leaders from Australia, China, and other places. At a time, as you've mentioned, James, when Australia's political relationship with China continues to show no signs of improvement, we could have no better speakers than our three speakers today. Ambassador Fletcher, Daniel Boyer, and Lachlan Crews. They're all very well known to AustCham and ACBC members, and we're delighted to have them with us today. They are not only witnesses to the great economic transformation that's taking place in China today, but they're also at the epicenter of this major geopolitical conflict between the US and China, into which Australia is being inextricably drawn at the moment. When the ambassador spoke to us last year, it wasn't long after our well-known Australian Chinese journalist Cheng Lei was taken into custody, and that continues to be a sorry state of affairs with no further certainty as to our outcome. Today, the China's Ministry for Foreign Affairs launched a fresh assault on Australia's government, with officials from the Foreign Affairs Department accusing Canberra of lacking accountability over alleged war crimes in Afghanistan, failing to address rights of Indigenous Australians, and even going so far as to suggest that the US, the EU and Britain should consider sanctions against Australia. So for even the most ardent observers of China, it's becoming increasingly difficult to make sense of the internal politics within China and what this means for Australia and Australian business. We hope that today's discussion will help to untangle some of those increasingly complex issues that we're facing. But balancing the security, the business and the political risks is a task that we all need to face. It's never been harder, and we don't pretend that it's going to get easier in the future. But security and prosperity are not an either or option. We need both. So before I hand back to James to introduce the ambassador and take us through the session, just let me make one more thank you to everybody in attendance. We all look forward to a time when we can get together for face-to-face meetings, but today in this web format, we'll be able to reach so many more of our members and others. Indeed, today we've had to lock off our registrations at just under 500, which is an all-time record for an ACBC webinar. Now, I'd particularly like to pay welcome regards to the hundreds of Australian ACBC members from every state and territory around Australia, to members of the Australian Chambers of Commerce in the mainland and in Hong Kong, to representatives of Austrade and various state, trade and investment offices with whom we have excellent working relationships, and to the many others that have joined us out of interest on this extraordinary topic. For those members those that aren't members of the ACBC, let me encourage you to sign up and join up as a member. Not only do you get access to webinars of quality such as this, but you also get access to a wealth of information that's available on our website, in our member-only working groups, and with access to both industry, government, and academic leaders in all areas of the relationship with China. So on that note, let me hand you back to James to take this forward. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, David. We'll now cross to Beijing to hear from Australia's ambassador to China on the state of the bilateral relationship. Ambassador Fletcher, thank you for making yourself available to our members once again, and it's over to you.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you, David, for that introduction, and greetings to all those spread around both China, Hong Kong and Australia. I had a look at my notes for our presentation last December, which is just over 3 months ago, and frankly, there's not been much significant change since that period. Our bilateral relationship with China remains under significant strain. We've experienced an unprecedented series of punitive measures from Beijing designed to damage our economy, exploit divisions and create political trouble for the government and induce back down on things that China is concerned about, or at least adjustments. And so in terms of goods trade, the measures have have either closed down or severely disrupted barley, coal, wine, cotton, timber, copper, and also affected to some degree meat, seafood, horticulture and dairy. Since December, a couple of things have happened. In the middle of March, we have requested the WTO to establish a dispute settlement panel to hear our concern or complaint, lodge a case on the anti-dumping and countervailing duties on barley. That's the first time we've taken a case in the WTO concerning China. We think we've got a very good grounds for doing so, but it's going to be a lengthy process. These cases usually take at least a year or two, possibly longer. The second thing is that we're coming to the end of the period in relation to wine. China launched an investigation into anti-dumping and countervailing duties and applied some interim provisional tariffs, and they expire quite soon. In the case of anti-dumping tomorrow, and countervailing duties in early April. So that could mean that the Chinese investigation comes to a conclusion and they make an announcement in that period. And the other thing to say is probably aware that there were quite a large number of ships waiting off China to unload coal. Last December, there were about 79. That's now down to around 40. So there's still a significant number of significant amount of coal sitting there off the coast. It's not our coal anymore. We've been paid for it, but it just shows the extent to which China is prepared to pay a price itself to make a political point. So collectively, the measures introduced last year, by the end of the year, had resulted in a drop of around 25% in terms of our goods exports to China, if you exclude iron ore. And those measures only really began in the very start of May, but really took force in November. So the full year impact we expect will be greater, and so this calendar year will probably see a much bigger impact. Nonetheless, the macroeconomic impact on Australia is almost negligible. We've got a flexible economy, quite resilient. Businesses, although it's been very disruptive to individual firms, that we are able to make adjustments. And so the total impact on the economy and on the government policy, frankly, is not really delivering the result that China wanted. We've been very upfront, very straightforward with China behind closed doors. We said, look, we can see what's happening. This is deliberate coercion, weaponising the economic relationship. Of course, they deny it, but everyone can see what's happening. And I think as the weeks go by, it's just taken for granted internationally that what is going on. No one is in any doubt about what's happening. So we've got essentially it's a standoff. Both sides are very determined. I mean, if you listen to the Chinese press statements, they're doubling down on their position, and certainly from the Australian government's point of view, we say we are not prepared to backtrack on important decisions that have been made. And because it is so public, it's actually harder for both sides or for either side to make any such adjustments. It's a little ironic that last year we were being accused by China of being too close to the United States, and that it was our unwillingness to make our own decisions that was the cause of our trouble. Following the US election, the China itself is anxiously trying to get back to talking to the United States, having a reset, yet maintaining the pressure on us. China has objected to the fact that the US is speaking in our favour. I'm not sure that China realises the damage that it's incurring, both in Australia and internationally. It's been exposed as quite unreliable as a trading partner and even vindictive. I'm not sure when they began this process that they expected it to get to this point, but now that they're here, sort of partway in or fully into a retaliation mode, now that it's not working, it's hard to know, are they going to have a rethink or just keep proceeding and do more of the same? The trouble is that Plan A, do a bit of subtle coercion behind the scenes, has worked with a couple of others in the past, at least up to a degree. And so they think economics dictates everything else, and that, if they can cause enough pain, that will surely deliver the political outcome that they want. It's ironic, again, that China insists that no amount of external pressure or criticism on whether it's Xinjiang or whatever will force or prompt it to change course, yet it expects other governments to have a different position, and that we will just backtrack on things that we consider our core interests. So really, we don't know whether there is a plan B or whether Beijing can objectively reassess the effect of what it's done and reconsider. It's possible China, looking at our political calendar, will be thinking, well, the election next year might give them some hope, and then they might try and wait out the current government. Well, we've said to them, you can't predict what any election result is going to be. People have lost a lot of people have been disappointed or surprised in the past, and even if there is a change, and one day there could well be, that doesn't mean that China's going to get what it wants. I mean, if you look at the key issues around telecommunications infrastructure, critical sort of investment areas, South China Sea strategic issues, human rights, Xinjiang, you name it. If anything, the opposition is as well. It's very close to what the government positions on these issues have been. So going forward, COVID and the pandemic and the impact of that, of course, is hitting our economy pretty hard. But the signals out of China in the last month or so, another warning on student safety and a review of, or some talk of a review of international education programs that Australian universities are operating within China, would suggest that they're going to have a look at education as another pressure point. So really, if the question is what else is at risk, I would say there's nothing off the table. The only areas where you think China really can't touch us is areas where we are the sole supplier, or at least a supplier that cannot be replaced. And so iron ore and wool, fine wool are the ones that come to mind. But I wouldn't, I can't rule out anything else. If someone said, what about this or that or the other? It's all possible if Beijing feels that somehow that's going to help them. I don't think it will help them. The logical endpoint of all this is just a step-by-step progressive decoupling of the very valuable economic links that have grown over the decades. And it's very, very bad for us, very bad for China. It's not good. Everything that we're doing with China is in the mutual interests of both sides. It's not, they're not doing us any favours. We're not doing them any favours. It's a very complementary, productive, beneficial business relationship that we're looking at. And to unpick that piece by piece really is not in the best interests of either side. So for the time being, we're being patient, pressing our case very firmly with China behind closed doors, taking steps that are open to us in terms of the international trade remedies actions, and just proceeding as careful as we can. For that, I'm not taking my full time because there's nothing really more to say on the bigger picture, but happy in due course to respond to questions. I know you've got a number of them.
Thank you, Ambassador, for that sobering update. We'll now hear from Lachlan Crews, the Minister Counsellor Economic at the Embassy, for an update on China's economy and its recently announced 5-year plan. Lachlan, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, James. So, look, I might talk very briefly about the economy first, and then we'll get into the 5-year plan, and then Daniel will elaborate a little bit more on what some of that means for particular sectors. China's economy has largely recovered from the impact of COVID last year. It hit very hard here in the first quarter of last year, but full-year GDP growth came in at 2.3%, and consensus forecasts for this year are out in the region of 8%, or perhaps even a little bit more than that. The early phases of the recovery in sort of August, September were dominated by state-led investment and exports. China was able to supply the PPE and the working from home electronics that was in demand everywhere around the world, and many of their major competitors were offline at the same time. Total Chinese trade, exports and imports rose to $4.65 trillion last year, the highest level since records began in 1950, according to Chinese customs data. We saw a bit of a change towards the end of last year. The recovery started to get a little bit more balanced. Consumption, household consumption, had always been the weak point in the recovery. It regained positive territory eventually, but then we saw a little bit of backsliding in that too earlier this year. There were a few local outbreaks of COVID in North China. Holiday travel over the Chinese New Year holiday period was down about 70%. And that took consumption back again, and it has yet to fully recover. Premier Lee's work report at the National People's Congress essentially said the outlook for macroeconomic policy was business as usual. The expression he used was no sharp turns, and said that the retreat from fiscal and monetary COVID stimulus in 2021 would be gradual and cautious. China does want to normalise policy, but it's going to do it very, very carefully and slowly because they don't want to put any more stress on the businesses who've already suffered so much. We can expect a little bit of fiscal consolidation in 2021. The central government deficit to GDP ratio should come back to 3.2% this year from 3.7% last year. On the household side, household debt to GDP ratio rose to 60% in the third quarter of 2020. So quite a significant increase, and the exact opposite of what happened to savings rates during COVID in Australia. So while the overall picture for the economy looks reasonably good, I think that increase in household debt is a clear indication that many people are still in a precarious position. So just turning to the 5-year plan. I'll read out the full title of this document because it's significant. The National People's Congress approved the outline of the 14th five-year plan, so 2021 to 2025, for national economic and social development and the long-range objectives through the year 2035. It's worth noting both halves of that overlong title. The five-year plan itself significantly does not specify a GDP growth target. The government work report that I mentioned earlier for 2021 says over 6%, but the long-range objectives that go together with the five-year plan imply an annual growth rate of 4.7% for China over the next 15 years, every year on average. The 14th five-year plan is pragmatic and flexible. It has fewer indicators than its predecessor, and a lower proportion of those indicators are binding. It gives policymakers the ability to adjust to circumstances without compromising adherence to the plan. Many of the indicators are set at levels that should be relatively easy to attain. While that should make outperformance easier, it also recognises that with the pandemic not yet over and the future trajectory of relations with the US unclear, China continues to face an uncertain external environment. I think there's also an element of this where the Chinese system is pivoting slightly from absolute quantity of growth and focusing more on quality of growth and some of those well-being indicators that are more difficult to measure than a simple GDP number. As with all five-year plans, the document's a framework. It sets out broad policy priorities. It's not a detailed roadmap for implementation, although it will be used to assess the performance of local officials across China, and companies will seek to use the priorities in the plan to advance their own projects. The plan will be fleshed out later this year by sector-specific five-year plans. Probably the most interesting one for Australia is the one that will come out towards the end of the year on energy. That will have implications for resources exports from Australia, and it will tell us a little bit more about China's position on climate change. It's clear that Xi's carbon neutral by 2060 pledge towards the end of last year is the new orthodoxy. It's being picked up at all levels of the Chinese system, and I think there's at least one question on it at the end. But there's not actually much detail in the five-year plan on that particular commitment. The setup of China's emissions trading scheme has been ongoing for at least 6 years. It doesn't seem to have moved on much since I was last in China. And peaking carbon emissions by 2030 at this point is business as usual. It will happen anyway. So to me, the five-year plan reflects the influence of the 6 ensures slogan from April 2020. So those are stability of employment, livelihoods, business survival, food and energy security, stable production and supply chains, and the stability of public institutions. The plan includes new targets for food production, 650 million tonnes of grain, and energy, 4,600 million tonnes of coal equivalent. Security, which is very broadly defined to include economic, financial, ecological, and public security, is a theme that runs throughout the five-year plan. Innovation and industry are clear priorities for China. China does not want to see its manufacturing base hollowed out as it develops. Interestingly, the previous five-year plan had a target for the increasing percentage of GDP allocated to the services sector. That target has gone, and this five-year plan says the proportion of manufacturing in the economy will remain roughly stable. So the five-year plan, it does have targets like 7% annual growth in R&D spending, aims to support China's transition to a high-tech manufacturing sector. Some of you may be familiar with the Made in China 2025 agenda. The slogan is gone. It attracted a lot of negative attention around the world when it came out, but the policy imperative to make China a world-leading power in those key fields is very much still alive. In the 2021 work report, Premier Li foreshadowed the need to create new strengths for the digital economy throughout the 14th five-year plan. The plan delivers on this by targeting an increase in the value added in the digital economy from 7.8% of GDP to 10% by 2025. And Daniel will talk a little bit more about that too. While seeking to increase digitalisation, the plan also increases scrutiny of internet platforms, continuing a government crackdown on monopolistic practices and unfair competition. I don't think we can expect to see the Alibabas and the Tencents broken up or significantly compromised, but it's very clear that the government wants them to toe the line and not swim outside their lane. Dual circulation, another slogan that you hear in economic circles in China, it's mostly about technology. It's not about boosting domestic growth. That's my view. China imports over $300 billion worth of semiconductors a year, so more than oil. And it can't make many of those domestically at the moment, particularly the higher end ones. China sees this very much as a vulnerability, and it will seek to manage down imports of high technology, but not energy or agri-food, although diversity of supply is a factor. There are lots of references in the plan to self-sufficiency, but it's important to note that is not across the board, not self-sufficiency in everything. There's very much a focus on high technology items and goods where China relies on a single source for a large share of imports. So dual circulation is really about reducing the risks of overdependence and making the economy more resilient to external supply shocks. We can expect reform and opening over the next 5 years will continue to be incremental and piecemeal. The focus of opening will be on sectors of strategic importance or areas where Chinese firms are already pretty well set up to compete with foreign companies. While China has committed to establish and implement a negative list for trade and services, which could benefit Australia in areas like healthcare and education, China will largely retain the government's broad discretion in its legal and regulatory decisions, which has often been a behind-the-border impediment to that investment. Some of the new investment measures, like the introduction of a national security screening mechanism here recently, and the so far unused unreliable entities list, will probably not make a lot of difference in practice, in the sense that the Chinese government has for many years retained the ability to make life difficult for investment that it doesn't support. But those measures will increase uncertainty for foreign companies. China points to the conclusion of the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment with the European Union and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, which also includes Australia, as evidence of its openness. China also committed in the NPC sessions to seeking accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. Understandably, Australians involved in trading with China over the last 12 months may have formed a different view about China's willingness to abide by high ambition and non-discriminatory trade commitments. There are intriguing signals in the plan on the need to increase China's outdated retirement ages. 50 for blue-collar women, 55 for white-collar women, and 60 for men. These were formed, in the 50s and 60s when life expectancy was much, much lower than it was today. They're clearly no longer relevant, but it's a political hot potato in how do you raise them by enough to make a difference to address China's demographic challenges without annoying a lot of people. And then within that, how do you get gender parity between women and men? It's going to be quite challenging politically, I think, for the government to do that. The 5-year plan talks a lot about increasing consumption. This is a long-running trope of Chinese economic policy. It doesn't really have many policies that set out how that's going to happen. The plan encourages internet platforms to lower fees. There are some modest programs to support purchases of cars and big-ticket electronics, and there'll be a little bit of increased urbanisation focused on a city cluster model that the government hopes will increase consumption as a result. There's also a focus, again, mostly rhetorical so far, on reducing inequality, which should help to boost consumption in the poorer households spend more of their income. But inequality actually rose in China under COVID. Salaried professionals could mostly work from home and get by, while insecure workers in the services industries lost weeks or months of income. So that drive to increase consumption still has a long way to go. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lachlan, for such a comprehensive analysis. I'm sure we'll unpack a lot of those themes in the subsequent Q&A. Now, another familiar face from the Embassy, Austrade's General Manager for Greater China, Daniel Boyer. Daniel has delivered countless economic and trade briefings over the last 12 months, and I'm sure is well known to many attendees here today. Thanks again for being with us, Daniel, and it's over to you.
Thanks, James, and thanks for the reference to countless. Sometimes I feel like that's exactly what my life was, particularly during the first half of last year when COVID was hitting. It was ACBC, AustCham doing a wonderful job actually connecting Australian exporters and business to the latest situation on the ground. So thanks also to Lachlan for a good précis into what I'm going to talk about, which is getting into the nuts and bolts of the 14th 5-year plan. I'll delve into a bit more detail in my 10 minutes and into the implications for business in particular. Then, as per the flyer, I'll share some of the latest insights on digital trends and consumer behaviour as well. Firstly, though, on the 5-year plan, insert all your normal caveats here. As Lachlan mentioned, this is a directional document rather than a line-by-line budget allocation, as we might see in the Australian context. Nevertheless, the plan does give cover for public and private sector activities within the Chinese economy, and is consequently a pretty useful read for anyone looking at longer-term business engagement here. Sector-specific plans, as Lachlan said, will be published over the coming months, breaking down some of the targets in the plan and providing more detailed action plans for implementation, for evaluation and reporting. We in Austrade will do more detailed analysis sector by sector as these future plans are released. For the moment, though, I'll stick to a high-level readout of the key priority sectors for Australian business engagement here, beginning with agriculture and food. 4 of the 19 chapters of the plan are focused on the agricultural industry and rural development. These include major measures to modernise agriculture in rural areas in order to lay a solid foundation for food production capability. China boasts, and for those of you who have listened into a lot of mine, you might have heard this statistic before, so I apologise, but China boasts around 20% of the world's population, but only 9% of its arable land, meaning that imported food will continue to be a part of the mix here for a long time to come. Measures in the plan seek to guarantee the supply of grain, for example, cotton, oil, sugar, meat, dairy, and more. This is largely a positive sign for Australia, at least in the longer term, and in spite of trade tensions, as our produce is still recognised by China's consumers as high quality, safe and clean. And many of our ag and F&B categories continue to do well here despite of the current challenges. Wheat, dairy, summer fruits, for example, remain strong. The plan also promotes the research, development and application of agri-tech, particularly smart agriculture, which also plays to some of Australia's digital technology sector strengths as well. On health, the plan seeks to build a powerful public health system with significant reforms in the medical and health sector focused on increasing both quality and efficiency. 7 of the 20 main indicators for economic and social development during the 5-year plan period come under the category of people's wellbeing. As Lachlan alluded to, more indicators than in any of the other 4 categories, which are out of interest: economic development, innovation, green ecology, and security safety. Notable targets include increasing the life expectancy of Chinese citizens by 1 year and increasing the number of licensed physicians from 2.9 to 3.2 per 1,000 population. A primary focus for Austrade in market is seeking to build China's understanding of Australian capability in health and medical training and professional development. The plan also promotes the construction of public hospitals, which potentially presents opportunities around things like hospital design. As China grapples with an ageing society, like many developed countries around the world, the plan proposes the implementation of a detailed national strategy. Efforts include developing elderly care services, building a system that integrates home, communities and healthcare facilities, improving the network of community and home-based services for elderly care, and making public facilities more elderly friendly. Moving on to mineral resources, this isn't a particular focus of the plan. As Lachlan mentioned, there is a sub-plan that will come out in the near future in this area that we'll read with great interest. But it does mention that China will continue the construction of infrastructure, which means the demand for resources, especially iron ore, will likely continue into the foreseeable future. China's steel production capacity and output is forecast to continue to increase in 2021. On manufacturing, the plan promotes the implementation of smart and green manufacturing, encouraging enterprises to adopt new technologies and upgrade equipment as well. We've obviously got strong capability in these areas of manufacturing solutions, which we're promoting here together with urban design, waste solutions and other related capability. Beyond that, as Lachlan said, there is the drive around dual circulation and the particular impact that has on aspects of manufacturing within China as well, as China looks to shore up some of its critical supply chains. Finally, on the digital economy, there are 4 out of 19 chapters dedicated to building a digital China. The plan promotes industrialisation of the digital economy, cultivating emerging industries such as artificial intelligence, big data, blockchain, cloud computing and more. Digital tech innovation and application, from smart transportation to smart logistics to smart energy to smart health, are all emphasised within the plan. Austrade supports quite a number of businesses across e-commerce, smart cities, fintech, immersive media, data analytics and digital health. So this is an area that we're reasonably comfortable with Australian capability in, and we're seeing already pretty reasonable ground being made by Australian companies here. Obviously, engaging on digital tech in China is not without its risks and challenges around data security and intellectual property, for example. But the opportunities that come with scale and a substantially digitised population are immense in China, and we're here to help with advice to firms who are in these industries and interested in engaging. Moving away from the 14th five-year plan now and continuing to focus on digital, I wanted to give you a quick overview of some of the key numbers behind China's recent and continued digitisation. I say recent because COVID accelerated much of the patterns that we were already seeing within the Chinese economy from the previous 5 years. China's now approaching 1 billion citizens online for the first time, with over 85 million online users added in the 12 months to March 2021. While this represents over 70% of China's population and is in part, as I said, due to the significant increase of people who moved online during COVID, only 31% of internet users are from rural areas, indicating room for further growth. Over the same period, the online shopping population grew by over 72 million to reach a staggering 782 million people. People watching e-commerce live streams grew by 123 million people. Just to emphasise, that is 5 times the population of Australia, to 388 million in the year to December last year. And approximately 2/3 of live stream users have made a purchase while watching live stream broadcasts, pointing to the continued emergence of this format as a marketing force. Subsectors achieving particularly high growth in online sales in the year to March included food, with an increase of 31%, apparel and footwear at 6%, and non-food consumer products at 16%. And it isn't just retail that's gone online. Remote education and healthcare surged in 2020, with internet access to schools reaching pretty much 100% nationwide, 99.7% nationwide. Pre-COVID, China had 165 million users of digital health services. In the 3 months from February to April last year, WeDoctor alone had 140 million users. Now, these people may have made their way online. They won't be going back, at least not entirely. It's one of the reasons why businesses here, and again, if you've seen me do a lot of these, you'll hear this talking point reasonably regularly, need to have a sound digital strategy underpinned by e-commerce and social media marketing. I also promised to talk about consumer sentiment. Lachlan mentioned that consumer demand is regaining positive territory. Reassuringly, research in our own engagement with business and consumers shows that Chinese consumer sentiment towards Australian goods and services remains relatively positive for the time being. Some of you might have heard me a couple of webinars recently talking about the outcomes of our digital B2B and B2C program, Festival of Australia, late last year, which hit about 120 million impressions. One of the key takeaways from that campaign was that positive and neutral sentiment amongst Chinese consumers towards Australia remained stable since the last time we ran a similar program 2 years ago. Consumers seem able to separate, at least for the time being, their own trust in the Australian brand from the contrary messages that they might be receiving from and hearing and reading elsewhere in China. We've seen this reinforced in research conducted by Hong Kong-based investment firm CSLA in late September, which showed that people under 40 were more positive about Australian products. Interestingly, consumers were more willing to believe the word of relatives overseas over their own government and state-sponsored media, which is an advantage given the size of the diaspora in Australia. I'll conclude the way I have the last few of these webinars by noting that while the current climate for doing business here is as challenging as we've seen and as many of our exporters have seen, China remains a market of immense opportunity in the medium to long term. We're still actively engaging firms and their partners in their efforts to, and their Chinese partners in their efforts to undertake business here, and still seeing a number of deals being done. We'll have more detailed information on the 5-year plan and what it means for business here as sector plans are released over the coming months. Until then, if you're looking for advice and guidance, just reach out, and I'll leave it there. Thanks, James.
Cheers. Thanks, Daniel. Now, I'll hand over to the CEO of the former CEO of AustCham Hong Kong, Jacinta Reddan, who'll moderate today's Q&A from member questions submitted prior to today's session. Jacinta, thanks for being with us again, and it's over to you.
Thank you, James, David, and thank you again, Ambassador and Lachlan and Daniel. There's always so much content. And the numbers are always staggering when you're talking about China, and we're very grateful to you for joining us today. I'm sitting here in the Hong Kong offices of Shinewing, and so we have people talking to you from Beijing, Hong Kong and Australia today. Ambassador, perhaps turning to you first, when we think about the opportunities, we really need to come down to the nuts and bolts, and that is travel. Many of us sitting here in China and in Hong Kong, and those in Australia wanting to get onto the ground in the mainland, are very much focused on when international travel might resume. There's a lot of conversations and pushes for international travel vaccine protocols to be established. Can you give us any perspective or insight into those protocols, and in particular in relation to timing?
Very good question. Something that we're all very focused on here, as you can imagine. Basically the suspension of all international travel over the past year or so has been unprecedented for all of us. Look, I just have to say governments at both ends here and in Australia are very careful and cautious about reopening the border. There's going to be a process at the Australian end which will look at jurisdictions which are successfully managing the virus, and of course China fits into that category along with a number of other places in this part of the world. And it's going to be data driven, so they're going to look at the prevalence of cases, the way that the jurisdiction is able to identify and deal with infection, and they'll come to conclusions over a matter of months, I think, rather than shorter than that, about the possibility of opening up one-way travel into Australia. Now, we've done it with New Zealand, that's the only one, but during the course of the year, I'm hopeful that we'll be looking at other jurisdictions to repeat that. Frankly, the direction or the trend here is not particularly promising. China's authorities are ever more concerned about preventing infections coming in from overseas. And when they look out the window at the world, they see the pandemic still very prevalent in most parts of the world. And so the quarantine procedures, testing, just getting a visa is really problematic. It's hard enough. I mean, diplomats get special exemption, but even then it's not straightforward. But for business people and others, it's almost impossible. And, you know, I don't know how long before they'll have confidence to start opening up. And if they will do it like we will, which is look at a particular place and say, look, how are they doing there in Australia on the virus? Can we trust their systems to actually bring people in without requiring more than just a test or a vaccine or something? So it's very early days. I mean, all governments are thinking about how do we get from where we are to where we want to be, but I don't think it's going to happen quickly. Beijing will host the Winter Olympics in February next year. It's possible that will be a point, for them at least, a reference point that they won't want to risk things getting out of hand again until that's out of the way. But, you know, they have made a number of adjustments in either direction, you know, based on the facts to hand. And they're certainly pragmatic and will, you know, they're going to do things which are sensible. It's just that the overall mindset, I think here, as in Australia, very cautious. No one wants to allow this to get out of hand.
Here in Hong Kong, the government's been rolling out very successfully current latest hiccups on packaging of some of the vaccines, but rolling out successfully the vaccination program. So can you comment on suggestions that Australia needs to have a coordinated view on the possibility of vaccine passports in order to open up travel?
Yeah, look, that's a Canberra decision. The WHO has made statements about that very concept. Look, I don't know how governments what position they'll finally come to, but certainly if you've got a population that is like in the UK, for instance, that is largely vaccinated, and then you see the case numbers drop, that gives other governments more confidence to say, well, you know, people from that location are less likely to be carrying the virus. And, you know, people recognise that once you've been vaccinated, you are much less likely to be a carrier. And so there will be arrangements developed, I'm sure. But at the moment, I mean, from here in Beijing, I don't know what the Australian government's position on that will be.
Thank you. It's certainly one we'll be following with great interest. Perhaps now stepping back more broadly, and you all really touched on this, but I guess, Ambassador, the observations you shared about the Australia-China relationship are very sobering. We did hope that the new Biden administration might give us new cause for optimism, but it seems that perhaps this is not the case. Can you share a little bit more about the change in the US administration and what that might mean for Australia-China relations?
Well, the US and China have had their first sort of formal engagement. There was a phone call between both leaders and then a meeting in Anchorage last week. No real surprises, I think. You know, the United States and China have very different views about a whole range of issues, and the fact that there's been a change of president and change of administration in the US doesn't eliminate those differences and those concerns that we share in most cases from the US side. It's interesting that China is looking to try and, you know, turn the clock back to how things used to be. I don't think the US is prepared to do that. We welcome, of course, US support for our position on you know, in terms of our relationship with China. What does that actually mean in practice? Probably not. You know, if you're a business that's suffering because you can't export to China, the fact that the Secretary of State, you know, is endorsing our position in a political sense probably won't give you much joy in the short term. But it's certainly, I mean, the US, you know, broadly speaking, is engaging with its allies and partners, wanting to rebuild its relationships with all its friends around the world, and we certainly very much welcome that. And we hope that, you know, we want to see a constructive US-China relationship resume, where both sides can deal effectively with each other and deal with problems. I mean, no one wants a standoff, and we want that to be repeated in our own relationship with China. I mean, we'd like to be able to deal with China at the political level. I mean, they complain about us ignoring their positions on things. They haven't actually taken the trouble to talk to our government at a political level for a couple of years now. So, you know, they shouldn't be, well, I won't go further, but I mean, we certainly want to see normal state-to-state relationships resume between Washington and Beijing and between Australia and China.
And picking up from something that you shared at the outset of this webinar, what is the political outcome you think that China is seeking to achieve? What will the circuit breaker be? Is there one?
Oh, well, that's two separate questions. I don't know what the circuit breaker will be. What's the outcome? Well, they want us to basically stop disagreeing with them in public, stop doing things that they don't like domestically that impact on, as they see their operations in Australia, whether it's investment or some of their activities of their personnel. They want us to respond to China's sensitivities. Now, we're very aware of China's sensitivities, and we think we do respond to them. In fact, I mean, it's a little unfair. If you look at what Australia has said and done in the last couple of years, it's not very different, and in many cases less objectionable from a Beijing perspective than, say, what certainly the Americans, but also some of the Europeans have done, including in recent times. Yet we're being singled out. But China feels where we have made it now, or we have almost made it, and it's about time we start calling the shots more. And we want you to. You want a country like Australia never to disagree with us in public. And we say, well, look, we have views about what's happening in Hong Kong. It affects us, and we've got a lot of Australians there. We are entitled to state our opinion. That is not interference. We are not interfering in Hong Kong. We are telling you what we think about it. And broadly speaking, China wants, it rejects our, it does not agree that we have the capability, that we're entitled to decide who's going to build our 5G network. We've decided we don't want certain suppliers to build it. That's our choice. China doesn't let foreigners build its networks. So, anyway. So it's on a whole range of fronts. China has raised the bar, or is trying to reset the parameters for how foreign governments engage with it. And we're not the only ones, experiencing this kind of pressure from China. I mean, the so-called wolf warrior thing, that's happening all over the place. And it's not winning many friends for China. There's, we hear a lot of sympathy and support quietly from a lot of countries that you mightn't necessarily expect around the world, who can see what's going on and say, look, we don't want to live in a world either where China's behaving like this and is able to set the agendas.
And again, the next point, I guess, I might address to Daniel, because we talk about this wolf warrior diplomacy that's being played out in the media and publicly. But Daniel, you touched on some of the actual on the ground, the business ties, the trade and investment, particularly interested in some of the trends that you've seen in Hong Kong recently. Can you touch on the actual practical impact on business ties here in Hong Kong and in China?
Yeah, a little. So I think it's worth noting that, to start with, the context is that this has been a really, really tough time for a lot of Australian exporters, and in particular subsectors. The notion of diversification and quickly adjusting or sending stuff into other markets is not easy. In some areas, it's a bit easier, particularly when you're talking about large commodities. But for, say, an Australian wine producer who's spent 20 or 30 years building up a really strong set of relationships in China, to have that particular rug whipped out from under their feet is a really, really challenging time. That said, it's not, the challenges in the commercial relationship are not having universal impacts across all aspects of trade and investment. We are still seeing deals being done. In fact, deals out of this part of the world that Austrade is engaged in, and recognise that is, a minority of the commercial activity. We're seeing more deals across my region than in any other region around the rest of the world, which tells you is probably as much about the fact that this particular part of the world has bounced back more quickly from COVID than other parts of the world, but also a reflection of the fact that businesses just got on with it, and that some of those long-standing commercial relationships are still sort of standing the test of time, even through tough times here. Part of that has also been a significant uptick in Hong Kong and Taiwan to a lesser extent, around F&B consumer products in particular. We have probably seen more stuff happen in our Hong Kong office and with the Hong Kong market over the last sort of 6 months than we probably have in any of the last 5 years individually. So there's a lot of interest, both from Australian exporters. Now, obviously, Hong Kong, Taiwan are great markets, really good, in a lot of cases, open trading regimes, good consumer awareness of Australian product, but they're not the size and scale of China. And so they represent one potential aspect towards diversification. They don't represent a wholly whole replacement towards a China strategy. But it is very interesting watching some of the trends that we're seeing over the last few months in Hong Kong in particular, particularly around F&B.
Thanks. And then perhaps looking at flows the other way, we looked at some of the reforms that have occurred in Australia recently in relation to foreign investment, for example, and the significant fall in Chinese investment into Australia. Can you comment on that further, please? What has the impact been on the level of investment into Australia from China? In particular, Australia needs capital investment in infrastructure right across the nation, regardless of some population stagnation. But can you share a little bit more about the impact on the Chinese investment?
Yeah, not just infrastructure, I'd say. I might throw to Lachlan first, because, and then I'll talk about a little bit about what is happening on the ground in terms of the investors that we deal with.
So I think that the question about the reforms is reforms to the Foreign Acquisitions and Takeovers Act, which came in on the 1st of January this year, which have to do with a range of national security amendments to the Act and a call-in power, a last resort option, things like that. But the data that we're looking at in relation to foreign investment is probably still data from 2020. So I think we saw the China International Investment database, the CHIA database that ANU maintains, showed that Chinese investment in Australia last year was down about 60%. That's certainly a significant fall amongst the pandemic and all the things that were going on. That fall, though, is consistent with a couple of things. One is a sort of a long-term trajectory of Chinese outbound investment, which has been falling in aggregate from sort of 2016, 2017, where it reached a very high peak. It's also consistent with falls that we've seen in outbound Chinese investment to other markets, and in particular to other developed country markets. There are multiple reasons behind that. One is to do with enhanced screening regimes in these countries, and Australia is probably in that category. That the Europeans, for example, in particular, have been ramping up their scrutiny of inbound Chinese foreign investment transactions. But it's also consistent with strengthening controls in China on what is allowed to go out. There is less and less tolerance, particularly for state-owned enterprises, but I think increasingly also for private companies, in making acquisitions that are outside a company's core business. The days of trophy acquisitions of luxury hotels or football teams by companies that had nothing to do with that business in China are gone. And all of those outbound transactions are looked at much more carefully by SASAC and NDRC, the two main regulators. But I'll hand over back to Daniel to go into particular sectors.
Yeah, the only other point I'd make about that 60% figure, Lachlan, is that it's kind of artificially high because the previous year the figure was bolstered by Meng Yo's enormous purchase of Bellamy's, which sort of significantly increased that particular year's that figures, so it made it look worse than it was. Look, in terms of actual investment decisions, it's still pretty too early to tell. I was having a conversation with David beforehand about the fact that investment has a long tail. It's a slow burn, as we say, and so often the things that you're seeing happening now are reflections of the environment 2 to 3 years ago, as opposed to immediate. Certainly, there's a lot of interest in the reforms from our investors and interested parties here, which is why we've been running a lot of information and Q&A sessions with our colleagues from DFAT and Treasury over the last couple of months, and we'll continue to do so as they roll out and get implemented. As I say, worth pointing out, I think that though China's investment has been consistently declining over the last 3 years, in line with, as Lachlan says, global trends, we do continue to facilitate deals. My team, my investment team, and once again, we are only party to a minority of the investment flows, largely, I think, because we have this little word called productive that goes in front of FDI, where we have certain restrictions as to what we can actually help and support and facilitate. But my team have already hit their target for FDIs 4 months ahead of schedule this financial year, in spite of COVID and the other challenges in terms of the relationship. In the second half of 2020, more than 250 investments with at least one Chinese partner were approved through our foreign investment system, accounting for about 20% of the total approvals. China is still our sixth largest source of FDI, with a stock of 46 billion in 2019, up from 3.6 billion 10 years ago. So we can talk about the decline over the last few years, but it's a decline off a very high watermark, would be my point. And that if you look at historical trends, they're still there. And you know, Chinese investors are, especially POEs, are similar to investors from all around the rest of the world. Really, in the end, what they're looking for is a place to put their money that will give them a return. And, you know, notwithstanding the bilateral relationship, that is the key core commercial concern that they will have when they're looking to put their money. And our argument would be that Australia, at the moment in particular, represents a very safe place to put your money. Maybe not hugely high yielding, but also not high risk either. I'll leave it there, actually, Jacinta.
Thanks. And coming back to the bilateral economic relationship, we continue to talk about complementarity of our markets, but is this the right way to look at that bilateral economic relationship? Are there other aspects that we should be taking into account? Who'd like to answer that?
Yeah. Look, I mean, it is the fundamental reason for the relationship to have developed the way it has is still there, and will exist long after, you know, we're doing this job and, you know, the people running China have moved on. There are some incredibly significant complementarity between our two economies. They're not going to go away. If only the politics could kind of move to one side and let what people want to do get back on to, you know, to doing it, then things would progress. So it's only a matter of time, I think. You know, China is not going to go away. We're not going to go away. And the things that we've got that China wants and vice versa are still there. So, you know, over time, sure, China won't need international education in the future to the same extent that it has wanted it to date. But it will want other things, and travel will still be a big thing once the pandemic is under control. That could take a number of years. We may have future pandemics, who knows? But anyway, in the long term, you know, the fundamentals are still there. So it's a question of being patient and trying to find useful things to do in the meantime. If you're a barley grower and you can't sell barley to China, well, grow. You know, they are growing other things, or they're, you know, looking for different markets for their produce.
And again, you know, we look at the 14th five-year plan and the continued push towards greater self-reliance for China. What does that mean from an Australian perspective? And is there long-term viability in the China market for Australian businesses?
So I think the answer to that really is yes. I think we need to look at China's comments about self-reliance in the context of their technology and trade war with the United States. China has discovered over the last 12 months that its companies like Huawei in particular, but also other tech companies and platforms, are highly vulnerable to disruptions in the supply, particularly of those high-end chips and semiconductors. And China's part of the 14th five-year plan, it's much about reducing vulnerability as it is about supporting growth. So China is very focused on self-reliance in those areas. But as Daniel said in his remarks, they're going to need to continue buying food from the rest of the world. They're going to need to continue buying energy. There's vibrant demand here for services, and that will continue, particularly as China's demographics deteriorate further. You know, the labour force here has been shrinking for 9 years now. So there'll be immense demand for aged care and health and things like that into the future. So the mix might change a little bit, but I don't think when China says self-reliance, we're not going back to autarky in the 50s.
Thank you. Belt and Road remains a key policy, and the Greater Bay Area is also an area of particular interest for those of us in this part of the world. Can you just talk a little bit more about those very high-level strategic areas of focus for China and what they might mean for Australia?
Look, I might just talk briefly about Belt and Road and then hand over to others for GBA, but there's been there seems to have been a slightly decreased emphasis at this year's political meetings on the Belt and Road. I think that's partly in the context of falling overseas investment. China's, the pandemic has increased China's uncertainty about investing into lots of different parts of the world, not just developed markets, but places where the virus is going crazy. So that has made the constant spruiking of the Belt and Road a little bit more difficult when it's happening in the context of actual declines in investment in many places, inability to travel. Probably some of those infrastructure projects are on hold. And I think in some countries, at least, there's rising scepticism about what countries are really getting when they subscribe to a Belt and Road project. I think in Italy, there's a little bit of, people are having second thoughts about whether it's being a Belt and Road country has really paid off for them. It won't disappear entirely from the rhetorical toolkit, but it's certainly not on the ascendant. But I might pass to others for Greater Bay Area.
Did you want to say anything on Greater Bay? I'm happy to. Greater Bay, how do I start this this answer? I think I'd say cautiously optimistic in the long term. How public service is that in terms of a response? I think the sentiment behind Greater Bay is really a powerful one. The idea of this extraordinary collection of people, commerce and trade in particular, and within southern China is one that you can see the potential of, but it kind of has to be underpinned by changes to very practical things like taxation arrangements, freedom of movement, all of those sorts of things, which hasn't happened yet. And so my outside of Hainan, actually, Hainan sort of presents an early interesting example of moving towards a tax-free arrangement for some imports coming into the country. And we're looking very closely at that because that actually has a very practical implication for Chinese firms, for Australian firms who are looking at some of the stuff that they can bring in through Hainan. But outside of that, when you actually start to see changes to taxation treatments or changes to movement arrangements, that's when you potentially get into a space where we can really sprue this and turn it into a selling point for Australian companies coming into this part of the world. I think that potentially also drives, if that drives a greater number of firms with capital to invest overseas, for example, that would obviously be of interest to us as well. I would say that southern China is quite an area of interest for us in terms of investment anyway. Shenzhen in particular, where we have an office, probably about 70% of the function of that small office is investment related. Hong Kong, pretty substantial amount of our time in Hong Kong is dedicated towards investment as well, and to a lesser extent Guangzhou as well. So we're already looking at that part of the world from an investment perspective. And if the GBA reforms drive an increased number of firms that are ready and willing to look overseas in terms of investing capital, we'd be really interested in that as well.
And if we look more precisely, I guess, at the actual opportunity for those on this webinar who are in Australia, looking at what GBA might mean for them, how many Australian companies, or perhaps not quantifying it, but are there Australian companies actually on the ground in GBA that have found a commercial, successful way to operate?
As a result of GBA, I think minimal. Certainly, there are a lot of Australian companies engaged with southern China and Hong Kong and Macau, though. Substantial numbers for obvious reasons. I mean, I think, in fact, one of the people on this call, David, might actually have more of an answer around what he's seeing in terms of KWM's operations down in the south, and whether they're seeing a significant uptick in Australian firms' engagement with it. But my short answer is, not until we actually see concrete reforms being made rather than just the rhetorical flourish associated with GBA at the moment. But I don't know, genuinely, David, I don't know whether you've got an alternative or contrasting views.
I think you've summarised it very well. There's a lot of interest in the GBA. There was a seminar just held a couple of weeks ago. I think we had over 350 people in the audience in Australia interested to find out more about GBA opportunities. The reality is that at a practical level, right now, there are a number of impediments. I think the interesting area, though, we haven't got a lot of time to talk about it, but is the role that Hong Kong might play in the Greater Bay Area. Hong Kong is part of the GBA, and there's a lot of effort that's been put in now to facilitate, the freedom of movement and tax issues between those jurisdictions. Obviously, COVID at the moment is hindering that significantly, but from my perspective and observations, I think that we will see some significant change towards the end of this year.
Thank you. I'm turning to trade, and I am conscious of time. There's so many questions and so much substance in this conversation this morning. But again, it's been such a difficult year across many sectors. Do you expect that there could be further disruption to trade, Ambassador? You said you didn't rule anything out when you touched on iron ore and fine wool, but how can business actually navigate this uncertainty, and how might business prepare for this?
Well, I mean, as I said, I can't rule anything out. And if I were running a company, you've just got to imagine that unexpectedly you may lose your China market for no good reason, other than that Beijing's decided to send a message to Canberra. Now that's a very, unwelcome situation, but I think that frankly that's where we're at.
And I'd add just on the risk mitigation issue and what businesses can do in response to that, Jacinta. Obviously, that's a question that I think every exporter to China will have been engaging with over the last year or two regularly. In fact, I'd be providing the advice to companies who are particularly exposed to a single market, regardless of trade tensions, and was, in fact, it was a constant theme of the advice that we were providing to companies forever in terms of China if they were overly exposed to this market. In the end, those are commercial decisions that every firm has to make. Different firms have different risk exposures through different products, and each of them have to make their own judgments about what's best for them and their shareholders and their members. I guess I would have a couple of thoughts about how you can mitigate risk, though. Stay informed and keep in touch about the latest things. Keep an eye on events like this, because we'll tell you the latest stuff. Pick up the phone, talk to us, watch our website, because we put pretty much weekly updates on the website in terms of what's happening in China. Maintain relationships. It's important, I think, now more than ever to stay in close and frequent contact with your importers and distributors here. Often you'll, as businesses, be the first to hear about new developments through your partners. Do let us know about that, because it helps us build a big picture that we can then present to other exporters, so to give them the latest information as well. Also, at some point in the medium term, when Australia-Chinese trade finds its new equilibrium, as I believe it will, those relationships will be critical. The last thing you want to do is to have to rebuild commercial connections and start all over again. My strong advice to my team at the moment is about maintaining those relationships with our customers, our importers and our distributors and partners in market, and I would provide the same advice to people who have Chinese exposure. Finally, look at diversification opportunities. As I said before, this is actually the same advice we've been providing to China exposed or any single market exposed business. I mean, we can help here in terms of identifying new markets. It's not as simple as turning off a tap in one room and turning it on in the other, of course. For some products, like I said, for a winemaker who's been selling here for 20 or 30 years, it's really tough to find a new market, certainly one of the scale that China offers. But we can help, and we are having some early success, particularly around ag, food and bev, in terms of helping some of those clients not navigate entirely away from China, although in the wine sector that's probably something that has to happen, but build up a greater portfolio of countries that you're exporting to.
Are you seeing other markets globally take advantage of the challenges that Australia's faced? And as a follow-up question to that, within that, are there actually opportunities for Australian business within that changing context?
Yes and yes, although the second yes is it's still really tough. Like shifting from one market to another isn't just a matter of clicking your fingers and wishing it so. It's hard. It takes time. It's practical and it's challenging. In terms of other countries coming in and cutting our lunch, yes, we are seeing it as you would expect. I mean, let's be honest. Commerce is like water. If the demand still stands in China, the water will flow here. And so, around coal, we've seen Indonesia and Mongolia in particular sort of replace our exports or our imports. Wine, France, Spain, Chile, Argentina, Italy to a lesser extent, barley, Canada, France, and the Ukraine have all sort of stepped in. And lobster, the New Zealanders are the ones who've benefited at least in the initial stage. But that's just a few. In terms of opportunities, we've seen some good outcomes around a couple of our big barley producers recently into other markets that they would otherwise not have considered if they'd kept on just sending stuff to China. Which is good. And we'll see that, I think, across the board. So, yes, there are opportunities. Don't know about opportunities in China. I mean, it is causing people to look at the relationship here a bit more holistically, I think. I mean, I've been banging on about the opportunities in the health sector, for example, for quite a long time in China. And I think more people are now focusing on that as the pressure comes on food and bev is sort of pushing into other markets. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Jacinta.
And of course, education being really critical, and many of those on this webinar would be involved in that sector. And one of the key things about international education is not just the dollar amount that flows into the economy, but it's the critical people-to-people relationships. And listening to you all share the fact that on the ground, Chinese consumers continue to view Australian goods and produce in a very favourable light, it all stems very much from that people-to-people engagement. Where do you see the international education sector looking into the future in relation to students from China?
Well, the critical thing here is having our borders opening again. And I know that institutions and state governments have been talking to Canberra about special charter flights and quarantine arrangements for students, which really haven't taken off yet. I think the Northern Territory is the only jurisdiction to have done that. And there's a bigger picture going on back home with the number of Australians still stuck abroad who want to come back and the priority being given to them. But yeah, look, if everything goes well in terms of pandemic controls and vaccinations, and Australia is in a position to reopen travel later this year, early next, I think we'll see, a very welcome resumption of student flows and education business between Australia and Asia, which will include China. I mean, the numbers have dropped a bit, as you would expect, with people stuck here having to do their courses online, but not hugely. And even though the vibe out of Beijing is Australia's racist and dangerous, etc., I mean, people are smarter than that. They can look on, they know what's going on in the US and Europe, and they say that Australia, well, actually, it's a pretty safe place and it's a nice place to go and study. So, we will see some impact, but I don't think we'll see the market disappear.
And very conscious that we're running over time, but one follow-on question from that to close with, if I may, Ambassador. We have a question from Angela Ellis, who has said, as a Tasmanian of Chinese origin, what opportunities do I have to do something positively to improve the relationship between the two countries?
Yeah, I think everybody engaged with China has the opportunity to just reinforce with their counterparts here the value that we place on this relationship, and that the worthwhileness of what we've been doing in recent decades and what we want to continue to do in the future, the genuineness of our engagement. I mean, Australia presents itself to China as a good faith partner Sure, we don't agree on everything, but we don't want the differences to be front and centre all the time and prevent us doing stuff which is frankly in both sides' interests. So let us get back to what we do best. I think individuals should say to their counterparts, you know me, I'm not hostile, I'm not attacking you. I want to do things which are good for both of us. Let's put the politics and all that stuff that you see in the newspapers to one side and focus on what is worthwhile between us. At the same time, for everybody in Australia, let's prove China wrong. I mean, when China says we are, a dangerous racist country, sure, there are incidents of concern, but the government and almost everybody that I've ever met believes we have zero tolerance for racism. We want to get rid of it and we want to be a welcoming country. Let's make that a reality, obviously, to those that we deal with. And that the genuineness of the connections that we've got as individuals with our counterparts is what gives me confidence that in the medium to long term, this is going to be a good relationship for both sides.
Thank you, James.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's a very nice note to leave on, and that concludes today's session. I want to extend thanks to all our speakers today, Ambassador Graham Fletcher, DFAT's Lachlan Crews, Austrade's Daniel Boyer, Jacinta Reddan from Hong Kong, and our own President, ACBC's David Olsen. A special thanks to the Ambassador and his team at the Embassy for being so frank and forthcoming and keeping the Australia-China business community abreast of a turbulent 12 months in the bilateral relationship. Thank you to Jessica Harrison and Shuangping Swo for their support behind the scenes. As mentioned, today's session is being recorded and will be sent out to all attendees, as well as being made available through the usual ACBC and Austrade channels. We'll also have an executive summary written up on today's briefing available for ACBC members next week, where we'll capture some of the key data from today's briefing. I'd also like to extend a thank you to all of the businesses on today's call. As David mentioned, this is our most highly attended webinar to date, and we're pleased to have such an engaged membership keen to hear the latest developments in Australia-China relations. Now, just as I leave you, I'm just going to share the screen. We're conducting our member survey at ACBC currently. A lot has changed in the last 12 months, and we're looking to shape the organisation as closely to member needs as possible. If you haven't yet completed the survey, we'd greatly appreciate you taking 4 minutes to let us know how we can better serve the needs of your business. Now, QR codes are par for the course in China, and the pandemic has been a crash course for using QR codes in Australia. So if you haven't used one yet, all you need to do is put your phone on camera mode and hold it up to the screen, and it will take you directly to the survey. So on that note, thank you again to all the panelists and attendees for today's session. We'll look forward to seeing you at the next ACBC National Briefing. See you later.